Thomas Ray and Crowe. I'm Gene Hudd. I'm head of special collections here at UNC Asheville, and kind of give you the program for today. I'll be telling you a little bit about what led to us being here together, and then I'll introduce Renee Ambroso, who will be interviewing Thomas about a writer's life. And after the show, after the interview and reading, Thomas will be reading some too. Thomas will have some books for sale if you're interested. This all started out when I got to know Thomas, and he donated a collection of his writings from regional newspapers to special collections. And although his main archival holdings are at Duke University, and it's over 100 linear feet, which is a big collection, and it's typically not the thing where a special collection will take in materials that are also held in another special collection. But this was special for us because these were writings, over 275 of them, that were written in regional newspapers, and I felt that it was important to have them indexed and available and searchable online in terms of what he'd written in Western North Carolina. So we brought those in, and it made a lot of sense to have them here. And the first thing I thought, this would be a great project for an English intern. As things went, I soon met Renee Ambroso, who was taking an Appalachian Foodways course with Dr. Erica Locklear. And Renee expressed an interest in an internship, and I said, well, would you be willing to work with this stuff for Thomas Ray and Crowe? And she went, oh yeah. So we crafted the internship together where she would work with this, and part of it was intentionally so she could meet Thomas and we could have this interview as part of the whole process. And Renee Ambroso is a junior here at UNC Asheville, and she's pursuing a degree in literature with a minor in psychology. On campus, she's a member of the National Literature Honor Society as well as Alpha Xi Delta, and she's the first. She's a poet and a writer. She's from Durham, where she graduated from the Durham School of Arts with a concentration in creative writing. Her poetry has been published in the high school's literary magazine, Portraits in Ink, and she received the Silver Key Award at the 2013 Scholastic Arts Awards and first place for high school poetry at the Phoenix Literary Festival at High Point University. And she's been working with us in special collections as an intern this semester. Renee?
Thank you. First of all, I just want to thank you all for coming and for Thomas coming to read some of his stuff for us. And Thomas Ray and Crowe is an internationally known writer, poet, editor, and founder of New Native Press and Fern Hill Records. He was born in 1949 in North Carolina, and after living abroad in France, moved to San Francisco to become the editor of Beatitude magazine and co-founder and director of the San Francisco International Poetry Festival. In 1979, he moved back to North Carolina and spent several years living off the grid in a cabin in Polk County, from which he would later write his award-winning memoir, Zorro's Field, My Life in the Appalachian Woods. Crowe continued to become editor of Katuah Journal, a bioregional journal of the Southern Appalachians, as well as editor-at-large for the Asheville Poetry Review. Crowe has also spent time living and writing at the Dylan Thomas Boathouse in Lorne, Wales, after which he published his book, The Lorne Poems, as well as an anthology of contemporary Celtic poets. Crowe now lives in Cullowhee, North Carolina, while continuing to write for the Smoky Mountain News and publish with New Native Press. His work is archived at Duke University Special Collections Library in Durham, North Carolina, and now also here at UNC Asheville. Over the past 4 months, I've had the privilege of working with Mr. Hyde in Special Collections of UNCA's Ramsey Library to archive a collection of Mr. Crowe's publications, including newspaper articles dating back to 1978 and publications from New Native Press. The result is Thomas Ray and Crowe Regional Publications Collection, which contains over 280 items, the majority from local publications such as the Smoky Mountain News and Asheville Citizen Times. So I'd like to start off by asking you to give us an overview of your writing career in your own words and describe some of the most important moments.
Okay, I hope we have enough time to do this today. Just listening to your introduction, it brings back so many different points and parts of my life and specific times and places. It's hard to know where to start, but it's only fitting that you start at the beginning. And so the beginning for me was growing up in my house and my mother reading to me every night before I went to bed. I grew up in very rural places in my youth. The most important one maybe was over in Graham County here, down the road a couple hours. At the time there was no television, there was no radio, and there was barely a telephone. And so all entertainment or all interchange on a literary level was done orally. So it was storytelling and anything else that you would get on that level would be oral in some way or another. And my mother would always read to me every night before I went to bed, sing songs to me. What I developed and what I was conscious of, because I can remember it still, being conscious of how when my mother would read to me, it'd be an auditory experience. The words would go into my ears, but what happened was that I would see pictures in my mind. It was like a screen. And I'd never seen television, so this wasn't something that I was getting from experience from television. It was totally organic. And I remember thinking that if I could ever write anything like my mother was reading to me, or I was reading myself, that would have that effect on other people, it would be more than magic. It would be kind of like the ultimate thing you could do in life. And so that thought kind of stayed with me, and my love of reading as a result of being read to continued, and I became a voracious reader, and I started scribbling poems when I was very young. And I had a second grade teacher over in Robbinsville who really encouraged, my interest in reading and writing. And as a matter of fact, she would let me go in behind the bookcases while everybody else was playing and doing other things. And I would make books. I would make these little books out of paper that I would staple together and maybe scribble some stuff in. Just making books. And that's where I started making books, which eventually ended up my becoming a publisher myself and publishing the work of other people through a New Native Press. But those were the beginnings. And from there, like I said, it's a long story. And I probably should leap forward quite a bit and just say that and hit some high points. Definitely one of the high points for me was living in France right after I graduated from college. I went almost immediately to France. In my mind as an expatriate, I wanted to be a French poet. I loved Rimbaud, Baudelaire, and Sartre and Crowe and all the French writers. I'd studied French in school, so I knew the language well enough to appreciate it and knew the culture. But I wanted to be a French poet. I thought to be a great poet, you had to be a French poet. So I moved to France and lived there for a short time, a lot shorter than I had intended. But then I went to San Francisco. When I came back to America, I moved to San Francisco. I was sick is why I came back. I developed a disease in France from drinking unpasteurized milk. And so I developed a form of brucellosis, which in people is called undulant fever, which is undiagnosable now in America because nobody ever gets it. So anyway, I was sick for a while, but then I had to kind of evaluate my life and figure out where I was going to go next. And so I decided to go where my heroes were. And my heroes were all in San Francisco at the time. And so, and I'm talking about the beat poets. So I went to San Francisco, and sure enough, it was great timing. The whole beat generation phenomenon had kind of taken a back seat to what was next on the media's agenda, and they weren't getting a lot of press, and they weren't getting all the accolades that they had in the 50s and early 60s. This was in the 70s now, and they were ripe to have any kind of young poets or people hang out with them and show their appreciation and for them to be kind of teachers or mentors. And so that's what we did. Me and myself and many other young people my age hung around our heroes for several years in San Francisco and did a lot of things. We created a magazine. We introduced Beatitude magazine and brought it back again. We did a lot of readings that started out on a very small scale, but then got larger and larger and larger until we created the San Francisco Poetry Festival in 1976. Had thousands of people for the Poetry Festival. So there was a real renaissance that happened during my time in San Francisco in literature, but also in the arts and music. And we integrated a lot of that. You know, we were working together in a lot of these events and stuff. And we did a lot of protesting, which is very beat. You know, I mean, there's always issues, and there were issues then. And we jumped right into that genre too. And it was what we called back then the University of the Streets. We were getting our education in the cafes and the bars from hanging around all our heroes who were in their 40s or maybe almost 50 by then, and just taking it all in by osmosis. And it wasn't structured in any way. It was just, you know, poets hanging around other poets. And that was my focus for several years. I didn't go to movies, I didn't go to rock concerts, I just focused on poetry because it was all right there. And I knew where I was and the possibility that I would have been given to the privilege, really, to be around these people whose work that I admired, and took full advantage of it. So that was that period. And then when I left California, I came back to North Carolina here in the mountains. I thought for the winter. I was living in a teepee up in the Sierras in Gary Snyder's community. At that time, I had done the city thing, and I was very infatuated by the bioregional movement that was going on, which was centered up in North San Juan, along the Yuba River, and Snyder and a lot of the back to the land people were living up there from the cities all over the country. And I moved up there and spent a year living up there with them. And it refocused everything for me. But I was living in a teepee in an old Maidu Indian village that had once been an old Maidu Indian village, ceremonial, a spiritual center. We were farming that, and in the wintertime is when it rains in Northern California, up in that area up near in the Sierra foothills. And so living in a teepee in chilly, wet weather for 3 or 4 months didn't sound like a lot of fun. And I'd spent a lot of time down along the Green River while I was at Furman University in college with an old mountain man there. And he had since died, and the cabin that he and I built there near the Green River was available to me at no cost, no rent, just to come and use anytime I wanted. So in my mind, I thought, well, I'll just go back and hang out in the cabin for the winter, then I'll come back to California. I never went back. I stayed in that cabin for 4 years with no electricity and no running water, and grew my own food and tried to survive the way that Thoreau did. Thoreau was one of my heroes, and while I was there that winter hanging out, I thought, I was rereading Walden and some of Thoreau's other work, and I had the thought, well, I'm 28 years old. Thoreau was 28 when he went to Walden. I don't have a job. I don't have a family. I don't have any responsibilities. I'm very healthy. If I'm ever going to do what Thoreau wrote about, now might be the time to do it. And so I hunkered down with this idea that I was going to see if I could be self-sufficient. I didn't know if I could do it. I had some of the skills to do it, but I'd never done it, and there's a big difference. So I spent 4 years over in Polk County doing that. And ever since then, I've been much more in touch with nature and the wild world and the earth and the planet and ideas of conservation and balance and harmony and all these kind of things that the ancient peoples that lived on this continent before us knew about and lived in accordance with. And we're really working and focused on that, environmental conservation, that kind of thing for the last 25, 30 years. And that's do in one way or another with those values. So I told you it would take a long time.
Okay, so you've been writing poetry and fiction for most of your life, and as you've been saying, you're a frequent contributor to magazines and newspapers. So what motivates you to keep writing, or was there ever a time in your life where you felt like you weren't motivated to write?
No, that question kind of reminds me of when people talk about writer's block. I don't believe in writer's block. If you have writer's block, it's because you don't want to write. Or either that or you're too self-critical. You should, lighten up and just have some fun. But no, I can't really think of any time when I didn't want to write. Because most of my life, my adult life anyway, I've had to write to make a living. Especially, I worked for a while at the Silva Herald in Silva, at the newspaper, local newspaper, and I got laid off. And because I got laid off, I got a year of unemployment for that. And so I had some time to think about what I was going to do and where I was going to go. And I decided I wanted to make my living as a writer. I'd never done that before. I mean, I'd made a little money here and there, but never mind the whole shebang, coming from my writing. And so I really launched into that, did research and did thinking and talked to people and tried to identify certain publications that, might be conducive to the things I was interested in and started writing, contacting these people in these places and seeing if they were interested in anybody doing any writing. And I was lucky almost everywhere. Every place I contacted, I got a positive answer. So there were several outlets. A lot of them were in the arts. There was the Arts Journal here in Asheville during those days. I wrote for them every issue for I don't know how many years. There was the Arts Journal down in Atlanta, the big one. I wrote for them. I mean, and I went national. I was writing for national magazines about the arts and literature, but also doing a lot of newspaper work. The Smoky Mountain News over in Waynesville had just started, and they were looking for reporters and writers, and I jumped on their wagon and started doing news reporting and editorials and book reviews and different things, and I'm still doing it with them. Not the news anymore, but I'm still writing book reviews and editorials. So it was a real, wide range. But it was all really because I needed to make a living.
Well, I think you just answered my next question, which was why did you decide to contribute to some of these local papers like the Smoky Mountain News, Asheville Citizen-Times, and stuff like that?
Well, it wasn't only to make money. I mean, there was also this bigger thing, like I was talking about before, coming out of the bioregional movement and becoming more attuned with nature and becoming involved with different environmental groups and programs. What I learned in California was that, you have to focus small. It's like the whole adage, small is beautiful. And instead of trying to save the whole planet by yourself, what you can do is just focus on where you live in your own community and try to do what you can to help in that way. And so my focus became Western North Carolina. At the time, there were a lot of issues that were very threatening and important, air pollution being one of them. I helped start an organization called the Canary Coalition, which was a kind of a clean air watchdog organization, and it's still going on 15 years later. I'm still on the board of the Canary Coalition. But there were a lot of, the Pigeon River was totally polluted. I mean, there was a lot of environmental issues, development, there was a big green light here in Western North Carolina for developers to come in and do whatever they wanted, because most of the counties in the west over here doesn't have any kind of land use regulations at all. So the developers could come in and have their way with the land and do whatever they wanted. So there were a lot of issues, and I felt like that it was part of my responsibility and duty to address these supervisors, with the county commissioners, with, you know, it's all part of everything. So depending on who you have on your county commissioners board, oftentimes determines what your regulations or not are in your county. And so I jumped in with some elections and trying to help get some people elected that had more progressive ideas about these things and more conservative in terms of conservation ideas about protection and all of that. So that was a lot of my motivation for writing and staying focused locally.
So like you mentioned a little bit just now, your mother was a big influence on your desire to become a writer when she would read to you when you were a child, and you even published your own children's book through New Dative Press. So can you explain a little bit about how this early experience helped you, you know, facilitate your literary career or had influence on you as a writer?
Well, I was speaking about that, you know, earlier. It was just at that young age, that time in your life when, you know, you're taking it all in and it all really stays with you. You know, I think those informative years, you know, people talk about it a lot, and, you know, it's like, well, is it really true? You know, it's just some psychological idea somebody came up with and everybody believes it because they studied it in school. But I think it's true. For me, looking back now, my years in Graham County were the years that really formed who I am. Not in every way, but certainly in terms of certain values and certain love of the natural world. It still is very a remote place and very wild back in Graham County. It hasn't changed much in the last 50 years. But I could literally walk out my back door, and if I wanted to, I could walk for days and never see another human being. And so nature was all around, everywhere. And I spent a lot of my time over at what was then Snowbird Indian School on the Snowbird Reservation. They had an Indian school there. The BIA was running the Indian school. It was a segregation like there was in most of the rest of the country at that time, where the Indians had their school, and in this case the Cherokee, and all the white folks had their own school in town. And at the time I was growing up there was still segregation. I spent a lot of my time out there, and so I was running through the woods barefoot with Cherokee boys, my own age, and we were all doing stuff, becoming blood brothers, and all the cool stuff that you do when you're young. And I learned how exciting it was to be free and wild in the natural world. I wasn't thinking about that then, but I was living it. And, you know, 50 years later, when I'm starting to think about things, as my life unravels toward the end, I think back on those years, and I realize how important they were for me in terms of my eventually coming to a place where I love the natural world. I feel protective of it. I feel like, you know, it's the only issue out there. You know, everything else breaks down into other issues, but without the natural world and without a balance in the natural world, without the diversity in the natural world, all the rest of it falls away. We don't have anything really in the end if we don't take care of our home, and our home is the planet. And in our case, it's Western North Carolina. It's these beautiful old mountains. They're the oldest mountains in the world. I mean, are you kidding? This is the Garden of Eden. When I would go to church on Sundays in Robbinsville at the Methodist Church, the pastor would always talk about the Garden of Eden. I don't know why. It was either the Garden of Eden or Adam and Eve or both. And he would, you know, and every time he would start rhapsodizing about the Garden of Eden, reading from the Bible and whatever, I'd start, at my naive young age, I thought he was talking about Graham County. Because my experience in the natural world was just like what he was reading right out of the Bible. It was beautiful. Everything was given, and we just lived beauty is still here. It's still here if you're looking for it, if you're aware and paying attention. And I think we need to focus more on that and be working more in that direction and not away from it, as a lot of people would have us do.
So moving on from North Carolina, I want to talk about San Francisco a little bit and how you're influenced by the literary scene there and the place.
This is another question that could take us a couple hours at least. Aside from Graham County, San Francisco, in my time in San Francisco, would be probably the two most important times of my life. Like I said, I happened to be there at the right time. Everybody was there, everybody was friendly. There was a lot of excited interest, youthful interest in the literary arts. I was hanging around my heroes. It doesn't get any better than that if you're an artist. It just doesn't. And it reminded me of Russia, right around the time of the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the incredible scene in St. Petersburg and Moscow that went on there, and in Paris during the 1920s, the incredible arts renaissance that went on there. Well, San Francisco was exactly the same. The same thing was going on. There were huge audiences for these readings we did, and interest in the arts and music. And it was seemingly endless. And I was right in the middle of it, and doing a lot of the organizing and the work behind Beatitude Magazine and press, and organizing a lot of these events. And there was a lot of offshoot from that, and the scene spread out into the whole Bay Area and Berkeley, and over, along Bolinas, along the coast, and down in Santa Cruz, and then up to the Yuba River. There was it was almost like Western North Carolina. There was this area about the size of Western North Carolina, and there were these little enclaves of, in my case, poets in all these places, and they were all doing different kinds of things. Very similar to what was going on in Russia, the different movements, the different cliques. Same thing in Paris in the 20s. And I was thinking about that all the time. And there was, just like then and there, in those places, there was a lot of interaction between these different groups. There was also a lot of competition. But just like it was in Russia and Paris in the early part of the 20th century, it was the competition was a benevolent competition, and we were all learning and taking from each other. We'd have these confrontations, these groups, in our reading maybe or something. And you'd hear the work that's coming from the community, 100 miles up north, and you go, wow, what are they, oh. So it's all informative, and it was all part of that University of the Streets, that I was talking about. It was just coming in a different format. And I learned a lot of lessons too. It's like when I was younger, I had held some of these people like Ginsberg and Ferlinghetti and Michael McClure and Diana Prima and William Burroughs and Gregory Corso. I held them, they were kind of gods to me, reading them in high school and that kind of thing. But I was hanging out with these people on a daily basis. They were sleeping in my kitchen and stuff, And but what you learn is people aren't always who they seem. And then especially with writers, and it's probably true of a lot of different other kinds of people as well, but writers that write these lofty, incredible, mystical, miraculous things, and you think, oh man, these people are just like gods, they're so smart, and they've got their act totally together. Wrong. They're human beings just like everybody else, and we've all got our frailties and our shortcomings, and it seems like in poets that their shortcomings are always magnified and much larger than any other group. I don't know why that is, but so there's lots of stories, and I've written about it, and there's books. I published a book with the Native Press. It's really a picture book of those years in San Francisco. the publications and the events and the people and all the things that went on during that Renaissance. So it's kind of a documentation, a historical documentation of that period.
So speaking of people not being what they seem, I wanted to ask you about labels, kind of like what does beat mean to you? And you've been called a baby beat, so what does this label mean to you? And did you ever feel like being called that restricted you as a writer?
No, it's a funny story. It's an ironic kind of story, paradoxical story in terms of how the moniker came to be. I'll tell you the story first and then I'll respond to it. Like I said, we were hanging out in the cafes and the bars, and there was a place across from City Lights bookstore called Specs. It's an old bar, been there for a long time. It's kind of a neighborhood bar, and all the locals went there, and we all hang out there, all us young guys and some of the older poets. We'd go there at night, and John Logan, the poet John Logan, was in town, and we heard about it. And we met him on the street one day near City Lights, and he says, "Oh, I'm going to be over at Specs tonight. Why don't you guys come over?" You know, and we always traveled in little groups. You know, it seems like all my friends. So that night we went to Specs, and John Logan was sitting in a booth in the back, and he was with Richard Brodigan, and they were back there, you know, talking and drinking. And so me and 2 or 3 friends walk up, and John gets all excited. You know, he's going, "Oh, hey," you know, he's real excited, you know, to have some young people around. But Brodigan was not happy. He wanted Logan all to himself. He had a thing about John Logan. He revered him kind of like I revered Ferlinghetti, you know, or something. And he didn't like the fact that we were going to horn in on his, you know, special time with John Logan. And he made it very clear and came out with this epithet. He turned to John, he says, "You don't want to hang out with these baby beats. They're just and blah, blah." So he actually came out with the phrase, but it was, you know, it was a negative connotation. And somehow that, and I don't know how it happened, but somehow that phrase and that story got to a writer in the San Francisco Chronicle who did all the literary stuff and the arts, and wrote a big piece on the beats, which wasn't unusual because it was always news in San Francisco when anything interesting was going on. And he wrote this whole piece and created the moniker of Baby Beats for all these younger people that were hanging out with all the older beat poets. And so it kind of stuck, and then people were kind of kidding us, "Oh, the baby beats," maybe, you know. But for me, it was a huge compliment because I had been linked in a way with my heroes, with the people whose work I really admired, and the people who I really admired, and as contemporary poets. And ever since then, I feel lucky to have been a part of the moniker of being a baby beat, because the beat generation literary tradition is one of the only literary movements that this country has actually created on its own, and that has survived and been the kind of influence it's been. It's been a huge influence on several generations now, well, at least 3. And those writers from that era and that movement, the beat movement, have had a big effect on America, at least in a literary sense, if not in other ways as well. And I feel, you know, very lucky to be associated with that tradition. And I like the fact that we're identified as the next generation, because now there's a whole generation that's coming on that are younger than I am, that have also been influenced by not only the writing of us baby beats, but also the beats, and the tradition goes on, which is also very much like the Russian tradition that I spoke about earlier. So I feel honored to be a part of that tradition, and it doesn't bother me at all, really.
So eventually you decided it was time to leave San Francisco. And so why did you come back to North Carolina?
Well, I alluded to that when we were talking earlier. I was living in the teepee, and living in a teepee in the winter in the Sierra foothills isn't exactly what you'd call a good idea. And so I came back here to spend the winter and got into being here and re-identifying with my childhood and growing up here and the environmental issues. And the other thing too is that living on the West Coast, those mountains out there are very young mountains, and you can feel that energy. The energy on the West Coast is very off the ground. A lot of ideas, a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of insanity, which is really good for a young person that's been grown up in a Southern Baptist, environment and on the East Coast South. It's good for me. I needed that. I needed to see that it existed. But it's very youthful and very almost off the ground. People would come up with ideas and things, but very few people would actually do stuff, manifest with things. And I realized when I spent the winter here after coming back that time, that these mountains really grounded me. I really realized that I was kind of off the ground too. I was kind of floating out there with all my heroes and everything, and I was emulating them. I wasn't finding my own voice. I was really trying to copy different people and be a poet in that way. And I realized that I felt a lot more grounded here. I felt a lot more relaxed and at home. And I realized that in my writing that I was doing that winter, that my poems were very different than they had been before. And they were kind of more original. And that was a big realization for me. Because I wanted to be my own person and my own poet. I didn't want to be a copycat. But up until that point, I really hadn't discovered what my voice was and what the focus was. And I very quickly found that the natural world was my focus. And higher consciousness, reading a lot about other religions, other philosophies and things, which I did a lot in the wintertime when I was living in the woods, because that was the time I could relax and really expand my mind instead of working my body for 6 or 9 months to survive. So I wanted to expand and to be more thoughtful in terms of a larger paradigm where the planet was concerned.
So you come back from California and decide to live self-sufficiently for what ended up being 4 years in a cabin out in the woods in Polk County, North Carolina. And it was about 20 years later that you actually went through the journals and started writing Zorro's Field. And so you were inspired by the writing of Thoreau and Emerson, which you have talked about. And you wrote that your objective was to live twice the time that Walden did at the edge of Walden Pond, to give myself a realistic opportunity to take the Walden experience and the life of relative seclusion a step further. So did this ideal change at all throughout your experience? And writing Zorro's Field 20 years later, do you think that returning to the woods was necessary for you at the time?
Returning to the woods meaning my original return, or going back 20 years later?
I mean the original.
Yeah. So just refresh my memory about this. Your question was.
Did this ideal of living the way that Walden did at the edge of Walden Pond, did that change throughout the 4 years that you spent there?
No. If anything, I would have stayed longer. The circumstances that occurred after 4 years were such that I was more or less forced to leave. I left by my own volition, but the circumstances there changed. It was a 250-acre-old mountain farm, and the patriarch that owned the property died. His children and relatives swarmed in and started making noises and started actually doing some of these things. They wanted to develop the property, cut down all the trees and sell it for lumber, cut down the orchards, run totally antithetical to what the owner of the property wanted for the land, and totally against my own values and what I had been working on with myself in terms of my ideas of what Thoreau proposed and all that. So if anything, it got stronger as I went along. 20 years later, I start writing a book out of necessity. I have a good friend, John Lane. He's a writer and he's the head of the Environmental Studies program at Wofford College in Spartanburg. We've been friends for a very long time, and he kept telling me, he said, Thomas, you should write a book about those years you spent in the woods. People would really like to read about that. And I wasn't too excited about writing a whole book about my experience. And I had never written a whole book, a prose book that way. And it would have been a big book, and it would have taken a long time. And I wasn't an experienced prose writer in that way. And so it was a little daunting, but I needed money. I was desperate for money. And he convinced me that it was a book that somebody might want and it might make some money. So what I did is I wrote a chapter a month in the Smoky Mountain News. That's how I wrote the whole book. 2 years, every month for 2 years, I wrote a 1,500-word chapter for the Smoky Mountain News. And I got so much feedback from those monthly articles that I knew that John Lane was probably right, that people would be interested in this book, because I was getting amazing feedback, and people would come up to me in the Eagles parking lot and say, I just read that piece you wrote on the bees. Well, I'm a beekeeper, and we'd start talking about bees for 45 minutes. That kind of stuff happened all the time. And people would be camped out in front of the newspaper waiting for the monthly issue to come out to read what I was going to do next. I mean, who would have figured? I certainly wouldn't have. But the book was like a magic miracle in my life. It just took off, and it really gave me an identity I didn't have as a poet or as a freelance writer. Major universities started using it for their environmental studies programs. It's still being used. It's been published in 4 languages. I just got a letter yesterday in the mail from Geneva, Switzerland, from a guy who had read the French version of Zorro's Field, wanting my autograph. This is a long time after Zorro's Field was published. I mean, the book's been out there and it's been in circulation and is available. I mean, they kept it in print, and like I say, it's in different languages. But it keeps happening. This was a shocker. I've never had this happen before. Somebody asked me for my autograph. Are you kidding? I'm not a movie star. But it did happen, and I've got it right here. I've got a copy. I can show you. I can prove it. So, in case you don't believe me. So anyway.
You talk about the winter months at Zorro's Field when you would spend a long period of time inside reading and writing. And were these intensive periods of writing, was it a new approach to writing for you than you previously had?
Well, yes, because it was very intense, very intensified, very intensive periods. I had 3 months. I'd take one subject and I'd focus on it for the whole winter. Reading books, I'd hitchhike down to the Hendersonville Library and get books through interlibrary loan. I'd have to order the books that I wanted usually. And I'd focus on, like one winter I did world religions, reading the books from world religions. One winter I did ethnology, reading, anthropological stuff. And so it went like that every winter. And my writing tended to focus on whatever it was I was reading and thinking about. I take long walks in the woods, after I've read something, just thinking and using my brain and not just my body all the time. And my poet, I was reading more Japanese poetry, the ancient Japanese poetry. Again, it was an influence from Thoreau, and so my writing, my poetry, I was only writing poetry then, and was shorter. It was more compact. It was more nature-based. It was more mystical, maybe. because I found as I was living in the woods that I became more and more of a more animistic in my spiritual thinking, more agnostic. In other words, I was becoming more a part of nature, and nature was my frame of reference. It wasn't some made-up myth that was created in Nicaea, in the early part of the first millennium. It was real, and the things around me were real, and there was what sustained me, and so my spiritual thinking was reflected in my writing. I wasn't writing a lot, but I kept this big ledger, and I would write in it almost every day, and that became really the detailed reference for Zorro's Field, because I had the details there. I was, chronicling all the plants that would come up in the spring and when the different things would happen in nature, so that I have exact dates and frames of reference, associations and things to draw from. But the poems that I wrote were almost all very nature-based and very merging on the more mystical, higher consciousness. I became at that time more interested in higher consciousness and awareness, and realized that putting toxic substances in my body wasn't helping my mind any. I wanted to be on a natural high. After the 60s, it's a long strip. I'll tell you, it was a long step, but it paid off, I think, and I found out too. I mean, lots of little things. Like I grew up, the thinking was when I was growing up that you had to eat meat 3 times a day to stay healthy and be strong. A lot of protein, a lot of meat. Well, I didn't ever eat any meat in Zorro's Field, hardly ever, except for a few fish once in a while, or a rattlesnake that somebody would bring me that I'd cook up or something. I mean, it wasn't much. And I was stronger and healthier, and my mind was more active than it had ever been in my life. And I realized I didn't need all that meat. I didn't need all that marijuana. I didn't need LSD. I didn't need all that stuff that we were, during my generation in the 60s, we grew up on thinking that was going to help us raise our consciousness, when in fact it was actually helping to do this. But it took 4 years in the woods for me, living clean that way, to realize all that. And I think that was a huge benefit for me in the long run.
So obviously, Zorro's Field was a really important place for you, and you wrote that during these years of isolation, I have come to believe that we must go home again. And do you think that it's important for every writer to do this?
No, I wrote an essay. It was on the birthday of Thomas Wolfe. The Asheville Citizen did this big thing back in the early. It was around 1980 or 81, I think, and the Citizen was running this big thing all during the whole period of time, right around Thomas Wolfe's either birth anniversary or maybe the publication of Look Homeward Angel or something. And he's famous for his book, You Can't Go Home Again. And so I was living in the woods for 3 or 4 years by then, and I was thinking, man, what would have happened to me if I hadn't come home again? And at that time I thought of, these mountains as my home. I wasn't born here, and I lived in a lot of other places, but at that moment in my life, I was relating to my childhood, and I had been there in that one little place for almost 4 years. And I said, no, he's got it wrong. You've got to go home again. If you want to, if you believe in community, and if you want to take what you've learned from being away from wherever you were raised in your home place and bringing that information and that experience back to a home place, especially places that were very remote and reserved and conservative, like where I grew up most of my childhood upbringing, to bring the more progressive thinking and more, I would call it higher consciousness thinking back home and integrate that into the community. And that's how we grow as a species. but that doesn't always happen. People leave home and they never go back home. And at the same time, in the essay that I wrote called "You Must Go Home Again," which was published in a newspaper here and is a chapbook, I lost my train of thought. I also kind of said that, not all of us can go home again. I mean, it's not for everybody. It's not possible. There's a lot of reasons why it's not possible. Or it's not practical, or it's not fun, or whatever. But for those who can, and for those who have been out in the world and learned something that might be of value to where they grew up, and if they love where they grew up, if they love that place, then it would seem to me almost an obligation for them to come back, at least for a while, and to share that experience with the people in the place that they love. We've been doing classes over at the Arboretum the last couple of years on writing about place and loving where you live and all these kind of things. And we're all writing and talking about the places we've lived and grew up and moved to and come to, in a lot of cases here in the mountains, and sharing our lives in these other places and telling and sharing with each other why we love this place, which is a new home for many, many people. Most of the people, I'd say, that live in Western North Carolina now weren't raised and born in Western North Carolina. If you went back and looked at the population statistics, I'm willing to guess that at least half, maybe a lot more, of people living here now were not born and raised here in these mountains. But they, in a lot of cases, the people that have moved here from other places sometimes love this place more than the people that were raised here, which is okay with me, because that's where the growth comes, that's where the progression comes, that's where the kind of change comes from that allows us to get better instead of going down.
So you waited until 20 years later, as you were explaining before, to write the actual memoirs, or as field. And did this change your perception of the time that you spent there?
No. But what it allows me to do, it allows me to go back there again in my mind, in my memory. The place itself has changed. The little cabin that I helped build and lived in is gone. They've put up an old metal building in the garden that I grew my food in, and so the orchard has been chopped down. The grape arbors are gone. It's essentially the same, but it's different in a lot of ways that were important to me. So when I think about my time there, I don't think about the metal building. I think about my whole experience. And a lot of it, sometimes I go back to the book, and that'll trigger memories and feelings. Because I've done a lot of public work with the book over the years in various ways. So I'm constantly going back, and the book is kind of a touchstone for me. And it's also a catalyst for my memory of that time. And I use that a lot. I go back and use that as a touchstone to help me remember the things that I learned there. I learned some really valuable lessons there, and sometimes I have to go back there to remember them, because you get caught up in your daily life and everything in the now, and you forget oftentimes maybe where you were trying to get to, or trying to move to, or where all that originated. And the book has been that kind of a touchstone for me. Maybe as an example, let me just read real quickly something that might illustrate what I'm talking about. This is just a little section from the chapter it's called The Wild Work, which is a phrase that was taken, that I took from Gary Snyder during the time that I was living up in the Sierra foothills with that community and with the bioregional movement. I write for almost 4 years. This has been my home. I'm talking about the little cabin down along the Green River, where I'm again amongst the familiar faunal faces of my youth. Black bear, wild turkey, hedgehog, peregrine falcon, gray fox, ruffed grouse, black snake, copperhead, and ever-present crows. With the gift of a roof over my head, enough cleared land to garden, and a few interruptions or temptations from the outside world, I've set up house and garden to take the Rose Walden experience even more self-sufficiently into the deep woods, to try to discover firsthand the organic and natural rhythms of the God-given world, as well as the ritual essences of self-sufficiency, self-confidence, and the purging of psychological fear. Where on full moon nights, I sit by the fire in deep thought, contemplating the physics of wildness based on common sense familiarity and observation, born of a life lived at the true speed of life, a speed born of wilderness, a life lived doing the wild work. The real and wild work is what we humans do with our intellect in efforts to organize and improvise ways of maintaining some modicum of balance with the natural world, allowing us a life of relative peace and possibility, and in good times, even a sense of security. Without this inner peace that comes with a deep inner knowing that we are at one with the wild world around us, there can really be no sense of security, and therefore we are not at rest, but rather are restless, fearful, tired. And we know from history what havoc is wreaked from fear and fatigue. So while fear and fatigue are inherently present in those few of us who attempt to live self-sufficiently on the land, we do try to minimize those weaknesses, those weakened and diluted states of body and mind, by giving ourselves a fair chance at a noble life of living at peace amidst the ordered anarchy of the wild. And this is the quote from Gary Snyder from Whence the Wild Word Came. He says, he defines the real work, as he called it, is what we really do and what our lives are. And if we can live the work we have to do, knowing that we are real and the world is real, then it becomes right. And that's the real work. To make the world as real as it is and to find ourselves as real as we are within it. It is what is to be done. To take the struggle on without the least hope of doing any good. To check the destruction of the interesting and necessary diversity of life on the planet so that the dance can go on a little better for a little longer. So that's where it took me. And that's where I still am when I think about going back to that place in those years, because that became my focus. I really embraced those thoughts and those words as something that I really wanted to try and live by. And I'm still working at it.
So I wanted to move on a little bit and talk about music. So you have your band called Thomas Rain Crowe and the Boat Rockers, and with them you've released a lot of spoken word set to music. So can you elaborate a little more on how you view the relationship between music and spoken word?
I can tell you how those two things came together in my life, and with the creation of the band, how that was formed. When I was in San Francisco, I was hanging out with other artists and writers and other musicians, and we'd put on readings and performances and festivals. We'd always include music, and I liked that combination. Nobody was doing music and spoken word at that time together, but sometime, must have been in the 1990s, I came across a recording by a Native American Sioux Indian named John Trudell, and he had done some albums of spoken word and music. and they were incredible. I mean, really, that's the only word I can think of to describe what he was doing with poetry and electric music. Very powerful stuff. He was head of the American Indian movement at one time, AIM. Very political, very, very political, and a lot of his lyrics, his spoken lyrics, are very political. A lot like Sherman Alexie's that we were talking about earlier, only more direct. And I thought, wow, this is really, really something. And what I understood was that, from my own experience, was that people weren't paying a lot of attention to poetry. Either they couldn't grasp it, or their minds, or they had been alienated from it in school, or whatever it might be. They really just weren't paying attention to it. They weren't reading a lot of it. They weren't listening, even when there'd be an audience and you'd be reciting. You get the feeling that they were kind of tuned out. They weren't really paying real close attention, and we couldn't get audiences to poetry events. And I thought, well, maybe if we combine music. Music has always been a popular medium, and look at the rock concerts. You get thousands and thousands of people just coming to listen to music. So I thought, well, okay, if we put music together with spoken word, with poetry, maybe people will come. Maybe we can get some people, and then maybe if they come with the music kind of as a background for the poetry, it might even penetrate their thick skulls. That's not being fair to the audience, but anyway, that's what it felt like being a poet in America at that time. Didn't feel like to me anybody was listening, and poets want to be heard. I mean, that's part of the job. Is to get the word out there, to sow the seeds, so to speak. But so I created the band and found some musicians here locally that wanted to be a part of that. And the band grew and changed, the members changed, the focus changed. For a while, we're doing an all-Hafez program with Middle Eastern musical instruments and arrangements, which was a lot of fun, and a lot of very profound poetry. I was translating Hafez at the time. And then we moved on to more political and environmental as well poetry. And music became more electric and louder, and the band was bigger. So it had some early origins. There was just 2 or 3 of us, and then it grew. And as it grew, the different musicians locally. We had some wonderful musicians from this area. People like Chris Rosser was in my band. Greg Olson, who lives up in Weaverville. Sal Dangio, who lives over in Black Mountain. Wayne Kirby, who was the head of the music department here at UNCA, was my bass player. And these were all very talented, very experienced musicians. Wayne Kirby was the bass player for Blondie in her early days. So I mean, these are people who had experience as musicians and could do anything. And so we moved around and tried different things, and had different kinds of focus for both the word, the spoken word part, and the music. But as we get older, it's harder to do all the legwork to find the gigs and do the rehearsals, and it just gets a little bit harder to do. And so we went out on a high note. It was a part of the Asheville Poetry Festival several years ago. And they booked me and Coleman Barks together to do a performance in a dueling Sufis. He was translating Rumi, and I was translating Hafez. And so my band had been doing all this Hafez stuff with the Middle Eastern instruments for 2 or 3 years. And so Coleman was all excited, because he was going to have really good music and everything. And so what we did is we had there was a club downtown, and we had the place packed. It was packed. There were people in the street. And Coleman would do a poem, and my band was going, and he would do a Rumi, and then I would do a Hafez. It was kind of like one of these things. It was all friendly, we're just having fun, really. but that's the way we booked it. And right in the middle of it, when things were just heating up and kind of hitting a zenith, for the evening, all of a sudden the police show up with the sirens going, the guns were drawn, and it's like, whoa, Apparently there were so many people that we broke the fire code. There was too many people in this small space. And so half the people in there had to leave. So that took a while, but as soon as they got that figured out, the police left, we started up again, and we were going back and forth. Here comes the police again. The people who had left the inside had gone outside. They were standing on the sidewalk and looking through the window. And we left the doors open so they could hear it. And the police didn't like that because they were blocking the sidewalk. I mean, come on. And so we figured that this is a good time. I did anyway. I said, go out when you're on top. And it makes a good story, the police come and they, the whole thing. It'd make a good movie if you'd had cameras there. It would make a good movie. But so that was the last time my band performed, and who knows,
So you've written about Bob Dylan as a major poetic influence and a musical one. So can you elaborate on how his work affected your writing or your music?
Well, his writing didn't affect my writing, but his writing affected my generation. He was the voice of my generation. I mean, there were a lot of voices, don't get me wrong. He wasn't the only voice by a long shot, but his status was kind of raised up by the media or whatever it was, as being the voice of my generation, the 60s generation, and rightfully so. His songs were appropriate. They were very high quality song lyrics. Everybody knew the words. He was one of the idols of my generation. And his recent induction as a Nobel laureate, to me, I thought was appropriate. It got a lot of criticism from the academic community and from other people because they didn't see him as a poet. They saw him as a musician. It was, how academia likes to segregate everything. And so, you can't give a Nobel Prize to a musician. He's writing songs. He's not writing literature. But a lot of these things that I read and heard forgot the fact that Bob Dylan, as a songwriter, and is a very, very good songwriter, I mean, his stuff will be around for a long, long time, was part of the Bardic tradition. It was pre-printing press literature that went on for thousands and thousands of years. And most poets and writers, storytellers that were part of the Bardic tradition for all those thousands of years, used musicians to accompany them when they recited Ovid and the great writers that we admire and acknowledge in the academic canon. Most of them spoke their work with musical accompaniment. Hafiz, all the great Sufi writers, they always had musical accompaniment. They still do in that part of the world. It's not unusual. It's just part of a long traditional culture, or a cultural tradition. And in my mind, Dylan falls into that. He's a bardic poet. And beside that, when he was young, he was like I was only 10 or 15 years earlier. He was hanging out with the Beats. There's movies that he made with the Beats that were made during the 60s that he was a part of, with Ginsberg and some of the other Corso and some of the other boroughs. So he was identifying himself as a poet, and he said, and I found documentation where he says, "Yes, I'm a poet." Later, after his book Tarantula got a lot of negative criticism, he altered that phrase. He started calling himself a guitar poet. Okay, that's fine. And then now these days he calls himself a troubadour. Okay, people. I mean, how many clues do you need, to get to the word bardic and to embrace the whole idea of the bardic tradition? And it's literature. His form of literature has been going on for thousands of years, not 200, like the printed tradition's been going on for, or whatever it's been, 400, whatever it's been. And he's one of the great writers in that tradition. So why not give him the Nobel Prize? I mean, and I applaud the Nobel Committee for being able to think outside the box and to bring him in his tradition, which is the oldest tradition, literary tradition in the world for us people as humans, back into the ballpark. You know, so who knows? Maybe Leonard Cohen will someday win the Nobel Prize.
Are there any other musicians who were big influences on you?
Almost all the rock bands of the 60s. If you go back and if you really study the lyrics from the rock bands in the 60s, almost all of it's political. Almost all of it's about love. It's very communal, community, planetary, progressive, anti-establishment, a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it is. And that started with the folk music scene, and it progressed into the British invasion, and then, you know, the rock scene that followed, and through, you know, a decade or so more. I can, not to brag, but if I listening to the radio and a song from the 60s comes on, and I know Gene is like this, we've talked about it, within a few bars of music, I can identify the song. And usually, if I'm listening to the song, I can sing along with it. That's what people used to do before the printed word. People could recite the poets that they admired in these various bardic tradition cultures. And a lot of them still can. I was in Ireland one summer and hanging out in County Mayo on the west coast in this little pub called the George. And I was there until like 2 or 3 in the morning, and people were singing and reciting Robert Service poems for hours. These are Irish people that don't sit around and watch television all day and still have a very strong musical and bardic tradition in their culture. They're sitting around reciting poetry. It wasn't unusual back in the old days, and that influence, those lyrics, that consciousness, that energy, that revolution that never happened, was not about overthrowing the government. It was about installing inside the government a more wholesome and unified and accepting and compassionate form of governance that included everybody. In those days, especially the black community, that was the big issue at the time. Still is. Aside from Graham County, I would say that the rock music of the 60s was probably as big an influence on me as anything. Maybe not literally in terms of the influence of the lyrics onto my own poetry. Other poets have influenced me more than rock music has in terms of how I write, but not what I write necessarily, because I really believe that we were trying to do something very positive for our culture and our community and for our planet that needed to be done, and it needs to be done now, probably more so than ever. So we're still working. Some of us are still working on that. You know, we haven't given up on the 60s dream, and we're still out there plugging away, trying to do a little bit here and there, whatever we can do to try to make things more sustainable and balanced and better, so that my kids and your kids will have a beautiful Garden of Eden to live into. So.
Well, I just have one more question, and it's a little bit cliche, but what's the best piece of advice you've received as a writer?
That's a tough one, because I didn't really receive any literal advice. I didn't take any writing courses. I didn't have an MFA program as part of my life. I didn't take creative writing classes. Everything I did was self-generated, except, that I was hanging around other poets all the time. And after a certain point, especially in San Francisco, and then now afterwards, all my life, really, most of my friends are poets. They're all over the world. The advice that I've gotten is really just from knowing these people and from reading their writing. And so various things you take in by osmosis. And I would say that the advice that I've been given has mostly been taken in by osmosis, in that kind of way, just in knowing different people who have affected my life or influenced my life, or gained my attention for one reason or another, who I admire for different reasons, even though they're crazy. Especially because they're crazy sometimes. And I include myself in that group. So there's many things that I might say as advice if I was asked if somebody, what advice would you give to young writers? That's easier for me. And it's very simple for me. I would say read and write. The more you read, the better you are as a writer. It all goes in, you're not aware of it, but it's amazing. I was going back over some work that I wrote 25 years ago. I hadn't looked at it since, and on the envelope that all these poems were stuffed in, it said, "Not for publication." I'd written that on it. And I went back and started reading these poems that were not for publication, that I hadn't looked at it in 20 years or more. And I said, whoa, these aren't too bad after all. Very different. I wrote that. You surprise yourself. And it's all about, and a lot of it, I could recognize in some of the poems things that I had read, by other people, that had kind of creeped into the poems and whatnot, not plagiaristically, but ideas or kind of broken phrases that might indicate certain things that I was reading at the time, or influences. And they get in there and then they come back out. You're not aware of it. It's automatic almost. So reading is really important. And I was lucky enough to be a reader at a very early age. And I love to read. I still read a lot. But then the other thing is to write. If you're a writer, you got to write. And the more you write, the better you get. It's like an athlete. My father was a great athlete, and he was an all-star football player, All-American. And to be an All-American football player, you've got to practice a lot. It takes a lot of years, and a lot of times, and a lot of pain. And as a writer, it's the same thing. Your mind and your arm and your hands are your vehicle, and you have to exercise them. They have to be in good shape. To be a great football player, you've got to be in really good shape, and to be a great writer, you've got to be in really good shape. And the more you write, the better you get. It's just automatic, and you can't be too self-critical. You can't go into writing thinking, I'm not as good as James Joyce or something. You just can't go there, because you're not going to be as good as James Joyce, because you're not going to be like James Joyce. You're going to be something different than James Joyce. That's the whole point. You're you, and being you is like nobody else. Nobody else. Especially if you're really listening to your own voice and you're not trying to emulate somebody else. So, read and write. It's real simple.
Okay, well, those are all the questions I have.
Thomas, would you read something else?
Well, I could probably find something in 258 articles. No. I don't know how much time we've got, but this is the poem that started it all for me. I don't know how old I was. My mom would know, because she gave me this not too long ago to remind me. poem is the one that really, really got my attention. I remember it because I would ask for it every night. I would say, "Could you read that one again about the old dude with the glasses, you know?" And so it's called Grandpa Dropped His Glasses. Grandpa dropped his glasses once in a pot of dye. And when he put them on again, he saw a purple sky. Purple fires were rising up from a purple hill. Men were grinding purple cider at a purple mill. Purple Adeline was playing with a purple doll. Little purple dragonflies were crawling up the wall. And at the supper table, he got crazy as a loon from eating purple apple dumplings with a purple spoon. I'm telling you. When you're 5 years old, that's pretty cool stuff. No, it gets your mind and imagination going, you know. That's what it's all about. That's what it's all about. You know, more of us, all of us should use our minds and imaginations more and have fun. People ask me sometimes, you know, it's one of those questions, you know, something like somebody asking you, who's your favorite author? I mean, you can't really pick one person. It's not possible. For me, it's not. I've read too many good writers to be able to pick one out. But they ask, you know, what's your favorite poem that you've written? That I can do. I can't tell you why, but I do have a favorite poem, and it's a poem I wrote in the 70s when I was in San Francisco. I was studying ballet with the Pacific Ballet Company in San Francisco because at the age of 25 I thought I wanted to be a ballet dancer, which is absolutely ludicrous. My body was sore 100% of the time, that whole time. But anyway, I was dating a Swedish ballet dancer who was part of a New York dance company, whose picture I saw in a magazine in a cafe one morning. I don't know what it was, but it's something about that picture. I wrote to the magazine, I got this woman's address. In those days they would do those kind of things. I wrote her a letter. Several months later I got a letter back. Several months later from that, she appears at my door unannounced. So that's as much of the stories I'm going to tell you. But there is a poem. There is a poem. And this is the poem that came out of that whole story. It's called Learning to Dance. I am disappearing into the side of her body. Her body which when it lifts and turns also moves the earth. I have given up the toys of my childhood and my ambitions for old age, and have moved deep within the walls of her silver skin. I'm through with my love of suffering and the words that describe that love. I'm going to carry on a magnificent affair with the wind from the inside of her body where we both sleep. Friends, I am going deeper, even deeper inside than the animal or a blade of grass. I'm looking for the stones that lay to the side and in the bed of the great river. Among those stones, there is only one rock with my name. I will pick it up and hold it high above my head in the inner light. Outside, with her body, she is teaching the world to dance. I like love poems. Love poems have gone out of favor in the last 50 years. It's really, really hard to find a love poem in any anthology or a collection. There's no collections of love poems that I've come across in the last 50 years. There probably is something somewhere, but If you send a love poem to a magazine these days, you'll get a rejection almost every time. Why is that? Love is the whole deal. It's why we're here. If we can't be sensitive and vulnerable and surrender to ourselves and to our friends and the people around us, there's not much hope. And hope is about all we've got anymore, I think, you know. And we need to embrace these ideas and so start acting on them. And love poems was a way that humans expressed themselves for thousands of years. If you go back to the old stuff, almost all of it is love stories and love poetry. All the great myths and everything, they're these huge love stories. Think of Arthur and Guinevere and some of these great stories. They're all love stories, and the great poetry is all love poetry. Another poem of mine that is one of my favorites is another poem that I wrote in the 70s in San Francisco. One of the few poems from that time that are probably worth reading. But it's called The Perfect Work. Love is the perfect work. A music which rings all the bells in the temple. A special wind in the trees. Listen to the way the drummer hits lovingly his drums. The way the dancer moves over the warm earth. And watch as children leave their bodies behind on the old logs around the fire and sing. The world is aglow in the shadows of the children singing, of the sticks against wood, of the heavy silent breathing of the old ones who sit off to the sides of the circle and pray. When I'm at work in my garden, I take off my shoes. I let my other hands embrace dirt. I plant myself in this place. And knowing what love is, I wake in this place in my body, full of dream music, full of life. So, in a nutshell, if you ask a poet if he could leave one poem behind for posterity, what would it be? I think it would be, for me, it would be that one. I think probably, it'd be easy to pick other ones for different reasons, but part of the job of being a poet is to leave something behind that would be useful and helpful to humanity and all the other life forms that we live with. I embraced that. That was all part of the beat and baby beat tradition that we had. We believed that. It was an activist literary tradition. It wasn't passive. It wasn't ivory tower stuff. It was get in the streets and participate and be part of what's going on in the world around you and express it in a beautiful way, or maybe a very strong way, depending on what's needed at the time. And so I believe in being a public poet. I was gifted with the ability to be public. It took me a long time to get there. I was a very shy person growing up and was very intimidated to get up in front of groups and things, but I overcame that because I hung around enough people who I learned from that did get up in front of groups and did get out in the streets and express themselves in sometimes dangerous ways. So I was empowered by my association with all these people, and I imposed it upon myself to become that because I wanted to be part of that tradition and I wanted to contribute in that way. Not to sit off in a corner somewhere and write little ditties about my dog. I wanted to be part of the future. That's why I've become a very active person as a poet. I believe it's part of the job, if you want to call it a job, of the poet. And if you go back to the bardic traditions, that's what they did. They were totally integrated with their community and engaged and respected and had a job to perform and fulfill. And then did it very well. We're still reading their work thousands of years later, or hundreds of years later at least. So, unless you want to hear one more, a more recent poem, or do we not have to?
Let's have one more. We have, Thomas and I wondered whether we'd fill the time or not, and in fact we have, but we have time for one more poem.
Okay.
And a big thank you to Thomas and to Renee here too. So.
Right. I was hoping we'd have time to talk more about the Special Collections Library and what you folks are doing and the importance of that work and what your focus is here in terms of your own interests. I know that you're very interested in this region and Appalachian studies and culture and heritage, and that is something that I'm hoping that everybody here will look into and become involved with, and this guy is one of the best sources there is on that subject. So it's all about home and place and embracing where we are and trying to preserve it and to make it even better than it is. So and part of that comes from knowing where we come from, what the history is, and what the cultures were that were here before us, and how they lived and how they embraced those ideas or didn't, and whatever the case. So, but anyway, this is a poem. It's about this place. It's about the environment. It's about nature. It's a love poem, really, to this place in a certain way. It's an acrostic poem. I don't have anything that I can draw. For those of you who don't know what an acrostic poem is, it's a phrase or maybe a word that goes down the left column. You write it out down the column. In this case, the title of the poem is "She Goes Everywhere But Loves the Woods." And I've written down the column, "She Goes Everywhere But Loves the Woods." And every line starts with the letter of one of those words, and you fill it out and let that determine where the poem goes and how the language moves and everything. It's a wonderful, wonderful form, and it just happens to be one that I can do pretty easily. And so this is called "She Goes Everywhere But Loves the Woods." Say the word walk, and she's out the door, headed for the woods and any path that enters a green landscape that goes on forever and never ends, or wants to hold houses on its flanks or even its meadows where she's lost in the delicate sunshine warming the leaves of fan-veined plants as she enters the understory of buckeye, hickories, and thornless plums. Viburnums blaze the trail near flame azalea and fire pink as early spring morphs into early summer, and red buds with rosin and ring scar come to life like young flower girls at nature's nuptials, with lanceolate leaders and lobed leaves as palmates, having only fun on an outing into the everything of where the node of nightmares ends, and the real takes shape in the mid-vein of nightshade, wanting to be ragwort, and every step she takes, past pipevine and blue curls, by bloodroot and bouncing bed, where bees hover before making their way to foam flower, and up the trail past waterfalls to where black birch, house nuthatch, grosbeak, and winter wren. There on angel moss she sits to savor silence and the long whistle of wind that takes her to places only she can go, and goes willing to be wild, very close to wilderness and all that is perfect and protected, even as she eats wild blueberries and watercress she has found in canopied sunlight along the way. Then as crows call, she rises and makes haste to the top of the hill, where topsoil turns to galax and lyre leaf sage, and in every direction there is her favorite view of ridge lines, wandering east in lingering breast lines, not unlike her own, under thin cloth that has given milk to children old enough to have their own, who will grow up into the out of doors and be taken to the woods and shown what it is to move forward along paths and be wild. That is a love. So
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Gene.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions? This kind of, is the end of a formal part, and we've been recording it, of course, for the collections library. But if anybody has any questions, or if you've had enough, that's fine too. I understand it's been a lot of yakking. So,
What's your creative process like? Do you write every day? Do you get up at a certain time and start writing?
no, I have a lot of friends who are disciplined. I'm not one of those people. I write when the spirit moves me, and it can come anywhere, anytime, and in any form, poem, prose, whatever. I mean, it depends on where the ideas come from. But when I get an idea, I usually move on it. I don't wait. I'm not a procrastinator. Anyone that knows me knows that when I get an idea, I usually move on it, because I don't like coming back to things. That's just not me. Same with email. If somebody writes me an email, I write it right back, because I don't want a big list of emails, and I can't do that. So I write when the spirit moves, and it's a lot like the comparison I make is it's the difference between Mozart and Beethoven. Mozart got the music; it was automatic. He heard it. He wrote it down as he heard it. Beethoven was a worker. He was a rewriter. It was detailed and revise and get up every day, and very different process. But I've got friends who get up every morning. I talked about my friend John Lane down in Spartanburg, and he gets up every morning at 6 o'clock and does what he calls poetry push-ups. He writes poems. Some of them he throws away, a lot of them actually, but he does it. And it kind of goes along with what I was saying about advice to young writers. You got to write, and the more you do it, the better you get. So poetry to me, writing to me is like magic, especially poetry. I learned that from my mother, and seeing those pictures in my mind, it was like magic. And I said to myself when I was pretty young, and when I was in San Francisco, I said, if it ceases to be magic, I don't want to do it anymore, because to me it's all about that magic experience. It's exciting to me, and it's even more than exciting, it's fun. And when it ceases to be fun and becomes more like regimented in work, I've got a lot of other things I can do. So, yeah.
I was just curious to hear you talk about your identity as an Appalachian writer. Is it, going to California and coming from, Graham County, North Carolina, and going out there and going to France and all these other places and meeting all these people. When you came back here and you wrote, Zora's Field and some of the other things that you've written since coming back here, how's your identity as an Appalachian writer, or do you feel your identity as an Appalachian writer progressed over time to where you are today?
Well, I don't identify myself as an Appalachian writer. I identify myself as a writer who lives in Appalachia. I love this place. I love it a lot, and that's my connection. But I don't identify. My interests are too varied to just limit it to one moniker. And I certainly don't write Ron Rash type novels, which are very Appalachian. Very Appalachian, and he's an Appalachian novelist. He is, and he'll probably never escape that moniker, and I don't think he wants to, because I think he wants to write about his upbringing in these mountains, and he does it very well. But my interests are too varied. They're planetary. They're more than planetary. They're universal. I'm interested in cosmophysics. It's all part of the same picture. But saying that, one of my first languages was Appalachian dialect language. I grew up speaking what Jim Wayne Miller called Southern Mountain speech, with all the Chaucerian, Native American, Irish implications in all that, which I've coming back. It took me years and years to unlearn that language as my family moved to different places where that language was considered idiotic. like being thought of as being an idiot, so I changed the way I spoke. But when I came back here and re-immersed myself in the landscape and in the culture, I was hanging around a lot of older mountain people that spoke that language again. So I had to relearn the language. And what I discovered was that the language is rich in poetic content and texture and allusions and metaphors and things. It's just incredible.
And storytelling.
Yes.
Storytelling, which you're very, you do very well.
Yeah, and so I've tried to embrace the language as much as the identity of being an Appalachian. I'm not, I wasn't born here, number one, so I can never be that, and I don't write Appalachian fiction, or my subject matter isn't Appalachian, even though it may be based in this place in a lot of ways. I'm trying to incorporate the language into the poetry and into the prose, and using as much of it as makes sense without it becoming cliched or imposed, so in that way.
Right. Well, I also meant to use the term Appalachian writer in a forward sense, not in a backward sense, but in a progressive, as a role model, because I think there are, young people that look at someone like yourself that's written and lives here and, writes many things, but including about, here and your identity here, and that they could see you as somebody to look up to. And so I meant that as a, a leadership kind of, coming from this place that, with a voice that's unique to this background and coming from here.
Well, I don't think of myself in those kind of that high plateau place, but I do think that part of the job of being a poet is to be a role model and to leave behind something that may be of use and benefit to younger people coming up that either are from here or have come here and live here or raised here or maybe come here later in life that want to identify with this place because of their love for it. So in that sense, in my life if I've done some things in my life that have set a positive model for some other people, great. And if I've written some things that have stayed with people in a way that have helped them move into the future and do some of the things that I've alluded to, then great. But I don't sit around thinking about myself as a teacher or a sage or even an Appalachian mountain man. I don't, I've lived the life of an Appalachian mountain man for 4 years, but that doesn't qualify me to be an Appalachian mountain man or an Appalachian writer. So, like they say, it is what it is.
But one thing that you did do that was very regional and bioregional is you were involved with the Cotuit Journal for 10. Well, you were involved for a number of years and been going for about 10 years, which is my segue to a plug. Our friends at Appalachian State University are in the process of digitizing the full Cotuit Journal with the lessons and signed copyright agreements from Thomas and the editors, and that should be online probably this summer. It's just they're wrapping up the metadata on it now, but that'll be available for everyone. And that's a major Appalachian bioregional work.
Yeah, when we were doing it back in the 80s, early 80s, for me, there wasn't an audience for it. There really wasn't. And we tried, but we didn't try hard enough. And so it kind of came and went. But I think now, a lot of what we wrote about in the articles in the magazine and the focus on bioregionalism, on community, on spirituality, on native cultures, all those kind of things, people are more interested in that now. Either they're curious or they're wanting to take that, embrace that into their own lives and take it into the future like you're talking about. And so having that available, especially online, because everybody's on their gizmos now, that's how we get our information mostly, and having it available, I think is really great because we couldn't get it out there before. It was part of that 60s